That's really great feedback, Liz. Thank you. I can
Of
say
course.
that's not always the feedback we get. However, I appreciate it being delivered in this format as opposed to hiding behind an email and sending it off late at night. So thank you for that.
Anytime, anytime.
And 2 meetings in a row, Mel. 2 meetings in a
This
row.
is good. So any other feedback you're getting from your start of the school, Dave?
I was in East Kingston today. I popped over into Newfields for a little bit. Community care centers are up and running. Kids are enjoying each other's company. We had them outside running around a little bit. They were just having lunch. Still working on a couple of technology bugaboos, which is not unexpected given 5,000 students. But started having conversations about our planning process for returning to in-person. And so it looks like it could be a couple of months that we work through. Well, not a couple of months, I should say, about 6 weeks. But we just outlined a document over the weekend on what our next 4 stages will be on bringing more students back into the schools, and overcoming some of the staffing capacity issues that we have, particularly at the middle and the high school, where our greatest number of teachers seem to have the least amount of health and well-being capacity to be there. So, just working through those obstacles, but it's great when you have supportive parents like Liz who can share that and others that can feel that. We get that feedback. So that makes us feel a little bit better as we try to get kids back into it.
Which are the communities, David, that are in your district?
So naturally Exeter, but then Stratham, Newfields, East Kingston, Kensington, Brentwood, and naturally I'm forgetting one. I always do. East Kingston, Kensington, Brentwood, Exeter, Stratham, and Newfields. Yeah, it's 6. And then the cooperative school district is our 7th, and that's the middle and the high school, as well as SST and the adult ed, and that's funded by those 6 towns. And now naturally we're starting our budgeting process. We have a meeting tonight with the joint board to talk about our SAU office budget, which they approve, and then is apportioned through an assessment process of equalized valuation and ADM to the 6 towns and the cooperative. So it's about a $2.6 million budget that we run here to run a school district or an SAU of 5,000 students and about 1,500 employees. And then we have our 7 school district budgets that we've been working on that will start to unfold, 5 SB2s and 2 annual meetings. So this is a busy time.
Corrine, you must be pleased that you don't have to be in the same situation David's in.
Oh my God, this is my first fall with nothing to think about on school operations. It is golden. David, you got to try it.
Tell me about it. I've been wondering how you're able to make all of the meetings, Corinne, and now I know.
Now you know, yes.
And why you look so calm and relaxed. I haven't had a night's sleep in 6 months.
Oh, I know that you do gain your life back because holy cow. I just say, where did the last 10 years go? I think I lost 10 years of my life.
Yeah, I bet.
So watch out for that.
I've got like 103. Let's wait until 105, and we're expecting John to join us, as well as Susan. I've not heard from Susan. Carrie, you haven't heard from anybody, have you? Okay. All right.
Hey, Mel.
Yes.
You know what I
David.
was thinking might be helpful too, and sorry to sort of bring this back to school funding stuff, but on AIR's estimated cost model simulator, you know how we had some questions last week about the small schools weighting factor?
Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe, I think I'm probably going to ask the some group, whether it's School Administrators Association or something like that, to sort of take a look at that. But Dave Ryan, Corrine, if you could look at the schools that you're most familiar with, and I really want to sort of double check how that's all working out. then we can sort of, do a more in-depth test of all the, the cities, towns, and districts. So to see how that's working. But if there's issues, that we can uncover just by working close on a few ones that we know a lot about. And everybody has access to the estimated cost model simulator, right? That's on the website.
Yeah.
Okay.
I already could tell, Dave, we're going to run into some trouble out in East Kingston. 132 students with 23 staff members, and a default budget because the community is growing in terms of the number of people who don't have children in the system.
Mm-hmm.
We're more on fixed income now than ever. So they had a teaching contract as well as their budget defeated in March. And here we are now looking at how are we going to bring in some additional staff members to offset the needs to get back into school, because we have to have some form of remote instruction as well as in-person instruction, because they're demanding some choice around that, which means additional dollars. But now as we get into budget development season, there's a line that our town won't cross in terms of the number of dollars, because the school's so small. And so we've started to lose some students whose parents have decided, you know what, if we can't get into school and we're not going to be supported by the town, we're going to do something different. So our ADF goes down. And we just had a conversation today with Caitlin on the preliminary adequacy estimates. That is scary for 4 out of 6 of our towns. That she asked me not to share, but whatever. So, we're looking at those, types of schools, East Kingston, Newfields, and Kensington, where every student represents dollar bills. And even then, we won't be able to afford all of the services that they should be getting, like they would if they were at Main Street, Lincoln Street, Stratham, or even Brentwood.
Right. So, so these do these towns have operate their own elementary districts?
You do.
And your superintendency includes those districts?
That's correct.
Those elementaries plus the Exeter Co-op high school. Yeah, right.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, that's a complicated set of budgets. So.
Okay, let's start our meeting. This is a meeting of the Public Engagement Work Group of the Commissions to Study School Funding, and in accordance with the executive order by our governor, we can have this meeting. And we need to take a little roll call here. I'm Mel Myler, chair of the engagement group, Corrine, and I'm in Kentugat, New Hampshire. My wife is in the house someplace. Corrine?
Corrine Cascadden. I'm in my home office in Berlin, New Hampshire by myself.
David?
David Ryan, superintendent at SAU 16, in my office at 30 Linden Street in Exeter.
Susan?
I'm Susan Hewitt. I'm in my office in Concord, New Hampshire.
And we also have joining us other members of the commission, Chairman Luno.
Dave Luno here in Hopkinton with Ozzy the long-haired dachshund.
Mary Heath.
Hi, Mary Heath here in Manchester, alone. Well, no, my husband's in the other room. Anxious to hear the presentation today.
Jay Khan, are you there?
Present in my kitchen making lunch.
Okay.
Probably others in the house too. All sorts of, yeah.
So we also have guests. We have Carrie Pugh, Dr. Carrie Pugh.
Hi, Carrie Portree, Dover, New Hampshire, in my apartment alone.
And Liz Canada.
Liz Canada from Reaching Higher, in the moment alone in this room.
Okay. She has 2 boys at home that are remote learning as we speak. So, and we have another guest, Ellie.
Hi, I'm Ellie Mason with New Hampshire Listens in Portsmouth, New Hampshire right now.
Welcome, Ellie. So we have on the agenda today we have a report from Reaching Higher on a survey that was conducted, that they had conducted. And then we're going to hear a report of kind of a final report on the school district employee survey that was conducted. I also want to say before we get started, I mentioned this at our last meeting earlier today, but we are about to enter into a very important phase for this particular work group. One of the things that we need to make sure that we do as we start the engagement process with various groups at the end of this month and through the month of October is to ensure that the voices of the public are heard by the commission. We have a lot of experts on the commission. We've had outside research give us data, but what this group is going to do is going to provide the voices of a lot of people who aren't engaged normally in this kind of a process. And those voices are very important for the commission members to hear prior to any kind of conclusions that the commission ultimately makes. So we play a very important role here in providing a broad breadth of voices from the community to the commission. So that really is our charge in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So with that, why don't we open it up to Liz. And Liz, you have the floor to share with us your Reaching Higher report. Thank you for being here and sharing that with us.
Great, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to share information with you today on our school funding survey. As you know, my name is Liz Canada, and I'm the Interim Deputy Director at Reaching Higher. I'm also the Director of Policy and Practice at Reaching Higher, New Hampshire. I know that my teammates are listening in, so hello, Sarah Robinson and Sarah Earle. And I also wanted to share with you all that we have a new Executive Director, Dr. Karen Scolforo, who's joined our team, and I know she's listening in as well, so hello out there to the entire Reaching Higher team. In light of this I have a lot of information to share with you. I'm going to ask that you save your questions until the end, and that way I can maybe address them there, or more likely follow up with Carrie and Representative Myler afterwards with the answers. As I shared before we started the meeting officially, we also do have 2 remote learners in the house. So it's likely, based on historic data, that I will be interrupted during this presentation, and that I let them know, I let our 3rd grader know he can come up and ask for materials. He has some materials in here, though he did say to me, Liz, it's better if I have all my materials in advance. So he was trying to collect everything, so just as a heads up. I'm gonna share my screen so we can jump right in. Always good to remember that there are real kiddos on the other end of all of this school funding and school discussion. So I'm going to walk us through these slides together. Like I asked, if you can save your questions till the end, that would be very ideal. So a little bit about Reaching Higher. Quick overview. We are a nonpartisan public policy and community engagement resource for New Hampshire families, educators, elected officials, and the broader public. Our #1 policy priority is informing and supporting public engagement on school funding. And we do that through research and resources to make informed decisions. We have a broad set of research questions and community engagement initiatives through this year and beyond as well. So I'm here to talk to you about our school funding survey, which we released in the winter. We sought to gather data on the public's perception of how public schools across New Hampshire are funded, as well as how residents feel the schools in their districts are performing. And I want to be clear that this information that I have for you today is a snapshot pre-COVID, before respondents really knew that we would be in remote learning for that school year, and then for many communities for the start of this school year as well. So in some ways it's a different time, but in other ways it is a really good snapshot of how folks view funding and their schools at that time. A little bit about how we got the word out on this survey. We had it posted on our website, social media, through newsletters, and we shared it with leaders in the field to share with their networks. And a good example would be the Carsey School. I know that they shared it with their audience. The survey was open for 28 days total. It included 28 questions for respondents who reside in New Hampshire and 26 questions for those outside of New Hampshire. I haven't included all of the questions for you in this presentation because we do have limited time, but you can view those in the appendix of our full report. I'll certainly cover some of the relevant questions for this audience today, of course, but for our purposes, we are going to focus in on these 744 respondents who reside in New Hampshire. We're going to focus on these school funding questions that seem most pertinent to the conversations you've all been having recently. So looking a little bit at the demographics of those who completed our survey, of those 744 people. The most frequent responses for town of residence were from Concord, 64 people, Manchester, 46, and Dover, 38. Approximately 87% of our respondents report living in New Hampshire for more than 10 years. And so you can have a visual of this. Here you go. Lots of respondents who've been here for over 10 years. Of course, it decreases, as you can see on that visual. Here we have the age distribution of those who responded to the survey. Certainly large representation of individuals over the age of 35. Which is a good lead-in to our next slide about educational attainment. Of those who responded to the question regarding their highest degree achieved, 88% had earned a bachelor's degree or higher. Now, you know, Carrie was joking earlier that I listen in on all these calls, which is mostly true when I'm available. But I've heard this conversation come up around the engagement work group about trying to engage with folks who are pursuing their associate's degree, have just achieved it, and that's certainly a goal of ours too in our next round of surveying, as you can see from this slide here. 62% of our respondents indicated that they were directly connected to public schools, which was our identification, based on whether they selected one of these categories: a current parent or guardian of a K-12 student, educator, an administrator, staff member, or a school board member. Of note as well, 27% indicated that they are educators. So in looking at the demographics as an overview, if we took a truly random sample of 744 New Hampshire residents, we would not get a sample that looks like ours. And so these results do not necessarily reflect the views of the average New Hampshire resident. But I believe this is similar to a conversation that you had around the educator survey that was administered. And so with that, our analysis of the survey data does serve to start a discussion and identify questions for further research. So we're going to start with this statement. This is one of the statements that respondents saw on their survey. I believe that my school district's public schools receive the right amount of funding. We're starting here because it sets the stage for the rest of this presentation. Please notice that we did not specify the source of funding, and we did not ask whether funding was too much or too little. 67% of respondents either disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement that their schools receive the right amount of funding. 16% agreed with the sentiment. Participants were asked if overall funding for their district should increase, decrease, or stay about the same. They were then asked specifically about federal funding, state funding, and local funding, whether those should increase, decrease, or stay about the same. There's a lot happening in this visual, so I'm going to give you a moment to sort of take it in, and then I'm going to walk us through it a little bit more. The bottom you can see is the funding source: overall, federal, state, and local. And then the colors represent whether they want that to decrease, stay about the same, or increase. So let's walk through this a little bit more. 418 respondents thought that overall school funding should increase. 543 respondents thought that federal school funding should increase. And again, you can see the green and the peach to the left of that for federal funding as well, to see how many respondents for peach wanted federal funding to decrease, and green for federal funding to stay the same. For state funding, 571 respondents thought that state school funding should increase. And 426 respondents thought that local school funding should decrease. Of the respondents who answered all three questions, federal, state, and local, 44% indicated that they would like to see federal and state funding increase and local funding decrease. 13% wanted all three sources, federal, state, and local, to increase. And then 6% of respondents indicated that they would like to see all three sources decrease. We asked respondents for their best guess on the percentage of school funding that comes from federal, state, and local sources. This is the visual that participants saw, so I'm not going to ask you to fill this out right now. You don't need to worry about that. They could use the slide feature or type in the answer on the right-hand side. We also said that when added together, these three should equal 100%. So the first one was, based on your best guess, what is the percentage that comes from the federal government, and then state government, and then local government? So let's walk through each one individually. Based on your best guess, what percent of funding from public schools in your local school district comes from the federal government? Here is a histogram of the responses. To read this, you'll see the perceived percentages from federal sources are along the bottom from 0 to 100%. And then the number of respondents are on the left. You can see how high the bar goes. The blue line represents the average statewide proportion of funding from federal sources, which is 5.1%. That's sort of the actual amount that the federal level funds on a statewide basis. So 5.1% is the actual. And then shown another way, here is a box and whisker plot for the responses. And we can see that the median perceived proportion of federal funding was 15%. And again, the blue line shows the average statewide proportion at 5.1%. We can see clearly here that respondents tended to overestimate how much money comes from federal sources. Let's move on to the state funding. The question is, based on your best guess, what percent of funding for public schools in your local school district comes from the state government? Again, a histogram reflects the responses to this question. This time there are two lines. The red line represents the average statewide proportion of state funding when SWEPT is included as a state source. So if we are considering SWEPT as a state source, 31.2% is the statewide proportion of state funding. The blue line represents the average statewide proportion of state funding when SWEPT is included as a local source. That would be 20%. I'm not here to debate whether or not SWEPT is a state or local source. I know that was part of this morning's conversation. It has been an ongoing conversation in the commission. That is why you all are there. But I wanted to make sure that both perspectives are shown here so that whichever school of thought you are a part of, you are represented on this histogram. Again, we'll look at a box and whisker plot for the median. And as a reminder, the red line represents the average statewide proportion with SWEPT as a state source, 31.2%. And the blue line represents the statewide proportion of state funding when SWEPT is included as a local source, 20%. While respondents overestimated the proportion of funding from federal sources, as we saw earlier, they more accurately estimated the proportion of funding from state sources, especially when SWEPT was considered a local source. With that, let's move on to the local funding. The colors remain the same. Red shows the amount of local funding when SWEPT is included as a state source, 62.1%. Blue represents the average statewide proportion of local funding when SWEPT is included as a local source, 72.3%. So the question was, what percent of funding comes from the local government? Those are our responses. And most respondents estimated that between 50 and 75% of funding came from local sources. Additionally, for this, there was more variability in responses compared to federal or state sources. So we've asked respondents their estimations for the 3 individual sources. This next section explores respondents' attitudes about the direction of each funding source, whether they should increase, decrease, or stay about the same, based on their estimates of the proportion of funding that comes from each. So you can see what the respondent would see on the screen when they were completing the survey. Do you think that overall funding should increase, decrease, or stay about the same? So we talked a little bit about earlier. These plots explore respondent attitudes and estimates about federal funding. The top box plot shows respondents who said they want to see federal funding decrease. The middle shows respondents who said they want federal funding to stay about the same. And then the bottom plot shows those who want to see federal funding increase. Regardless of their response to whether they wanted the share of federal funding to change, respondents tended to overestimate the share of funding that it provided, which we saw earlier. These plots explore respondent attitudes and estimates about state funding. Again, those who want to see state funding decrease are in the top box plot. Those who want to see state funding stay the same are in the middle, and those who want to see state funding increase are at the bottom. And as a reminder, red shows SWEPT as a state source, and blue shows SWEPT as a local source. And finally, these plots explore respondent attitudes and estimates about local funding. Those who want to see the local funding responsibility decrease are at the top. Those who want it to stay about the same are in the middle. And those who want to see local funding increase are at the bottom. The group of respondents who would like to see a decrease in the local responsibility produced a median that was between the 2, quote unquote, correct responses. Respondents who indicated that they would like to see local funding increase or stay about the same tended to underestimate the amount of funding that is provided by local sources. So I've shown you a lot about respondents' perceptions of funding and sources. We also asked about spending. Respondents were asked to provide their best estimate of how much their local public school district spent each year per student. They were told that their estimate should include all funding sources. So as I was reviewing this yesterday, I thought the use of the word funding here could be confusing. So to be clear, what we're talking about here is spending. So these were the responses to this question. The most frequent response was $15,000, as you can see in the histogram. And this plot does not show any responses which exceeded $44,000 per student. Two-thirds of respondents estimated that their local public schools spend between $10,000 and $20,000 per year. And so everything that I've talked about today has been about statewide averages. And so we went one step further with this specific question to compare estimates to the true spending. So we compared respondent per student spending perceptions to the cost per pupil at the elementary school level as reported by the New Hampshire Department of Education. Each respondent's estimate was matched with the actual per student spending of their home district. to give a true representation of the perceptions of funding in their own community. So for example, we compared a participant from Concord's response to the actual spending in Concord. Same for Exeter, same for every community at the elementary school level. We excluded responses which were more than $100,000 per student. As shown here, respondents typically underestimated the amount spent per student in their district by $2,571. And that equates to about 14%. They're underestimating the cost by about 2571 or 14%. And no matter how we computed the deviations, and we did it a few different ways, deviation from elementary school cost, district-wide average cost, or weighted cost, the results showed that respondents were underestimating per student spending. This next question was about how tax dollars are used in a community. So the statement was, I believe that tax dollars invested in my public school district are used effectively. 50% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that the tax dollars invested in their public schools are used effectively, while 28% disagreed with that statement. I wanted to also share a few slides on some of the outcomes related questions we asked. There was a series of 3 questions asking participants their level of agreement for the following. I believe when students in my town or city graduate from high school, they are prepared to be successful in college. They are prepared to be successful in the workforce. They are prepared to be informed citizens. These were 3 distinct questions that I put together on one slide for you. So this one is specifically for the question regarding college. You'll see at the bottom that the 2 bars are about direct school connection. The left-hand side means that we classified them as not directly connected to the public schools. The right-hand side says, yes, they are connected to the public schools based on those answers I shared earlier. The top would be strongly agree, and then the gold is agree, green is neutral, and so on and so forth going down. So you can see 52% of respondents agreed that graduates from their school districts are prepared for college. This in comparison with the workforce question, 46% believed graduates were prepared for the workforce. Compared to the informed citizens question, 36% believed their schools prepared graduates to be informed citizens. So I have my contact information here. And checking the time, I think, yep, right on sort of the almost 30-minute mark. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen in case there are questions, if that sounds about right for folks.
So are there questions for Liz's presentation? Yeah, Susan.
Liz, can you make any general comments on how things broke out by age groups?
Not off the top of my head, but I can definitely get that information for you. I will. Are there specific questions, or the ones that I covered here would be most helpful? What would you like?
The ones that you covered here, I'm just curious if I make an assumption that people who are, say, 50 and above and perhaps don't have kids in school, if what they're suggesting is different than people, you picked out sort of the 35 plus group. And, you know, is that a reality, or is that a folklore that we all think about?
I can get that information back to you.
Thank you.
And the responses here were for everybody. So I didn't just zoom in on a certain age group, but I'm hearing from you that you're interested in broken out by age group, the responses.
In a broader way, I would say bifurcate if you can,
Sure.
rather than by age.
Sure.
Other questions for Liz?
Representative Luna, I think your hand is up over there.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Thanks, Mel. And so Liz, what's your take on the on how the survey might read on the I guess in view of the question that talked about increase in federal federal funds, state funds, and local funds, where would your read be on things like a state property tax in that context?
So this is very, very anecdotal. So yesterday, as I was reviewing these slides, I asked some folks if they had a property tax bill on hand, for example, because a question that I have when thinking about like the swept lines, for example, how many people who aren't on this call or listening sort of pick that apart as separate entities anyway? Like, what does that really look like? And what I noticed when people were hilariously sending me screenshots of their property tax bills was that sometimes it seems very clear that there are sort of two distinct items, and other times it all seems to be sort of folded together. It would be hard to parse out that there's a state tax versus a local tax. So I think, I don't know that I have a direct answer to your question, except that I'm not sure how many people would be able to articulate the differences between those items anyway. So that's why I wanted to make sure those lines were there for you, because if we think people, if we think people view the statewide property tax as a local tax, you read those box plots differently than if you think that people view it as a state tax. So we wanted to have that representation. I don't know, because I don't know how, I don't want to say how well informed, but I don't know how comfortable people are talking about the distinction.
I agree. Yeah. Thanks.
To say the least about
Yeah.
that whole discussion.
Other inquiries of Liz?
Mel, sorry.
Yeah, Jay and then Mary.
Thanks, Mel. Sorry, Mary. Didn't see your hand first. So at first I wrote down to myself that the perception was someone else should pay for educating the students in my town, my state, meaning people were looking for alternative funding sources to their property tax. Someone else should pay for educating students in my town. But when I looked at your results there, it didn't really show that. I mean, people actually, with the exception of 10% being, 15% being a lot different than 5% from the federal level. Otherwise, were you surprised that people came close to what the proportion between state and local contribution towards student education really is? Oh, you're muted.
Liz, you're muted, Liz.
Oh, good. I'm so glad, because I was sort of stumbling along there. So good for me. So I don't know that I would say I was surprised. If you think about sort of the audience of Reaching Higher, or folks who are maybe who would take this survey in the first place, they're probably more equipped overall to have these conversations, is my guess. Although I will say that I was pulled aside by folks in our town who were like, Liz, what are the right answers? I did that survey. So now tell me what the right answers were. So I think there was sort of a range, but for the most part, I think people are probably more comfortable speaking to these questions. With that said, I am so curious about people who might say, like, I want something to increase, and what they estimated it to be was actually lower than it was, like it's actually higher than what they expected. So those discrepancies, I would be so curious to follow up with people, you know, and find out, like, do they still want something to increase if there's actually more money coming in from that source, or is that enough? So there's like a lot of follow-up research questions to these, this data, but sort of a roundabout say, not entirely surprised in some of these. Although the underestimating how much is spent, I think that was the one that was, you know, we definitely zoomed in on a bit more.
I agree. $2,600 underestimation per town.
Yeah.
That is, I guess it says maybe we don't want people to know that information. Maybe we're a little apprehensive, huh? What are you thinking, Dave?
Mary?
Yeah, was that an underestimate or was it an overestimate?
They underestimated how much is spent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mary?
Liz, I thought you picked some very interesting municipalities to query. In your aggregating the information, did you in any way, were you able in any way to ascertain differences by community at all?
The numbers were pretty low. So we had respondents from 163 different municipalities, but many of them would be like 2 or 3. So it would be hard to draw conclusions from such small samples. Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, we would have so many responses that we could do something like that, but it would be really a dangerous game to draw conclusions with such small numbers.
It seemed that the people who answered the survey were pretty well-educated folks. Do you think that swayed this one way or the other?
I think it's definitely a limitation in our data set for sure. And it's something that we are being mindful of as we talk about the next round of what surveying might look like and how do we get these surveys into the hands of folks who definitely represent New Hampshire in a more holistic way.
Thank you.
Of course.
Other questions of Ms. Liz? Yes, Bruce, Mallory.
Yeah, Liz, thanks so much. This is really interesting, and thanks for all your work. I'm curious about, I think it was more than a quarter of your respondents are part of education. They're educators, they're administrators. Did you look at the accuracy or separate out the responses from that 27% or so versus the other population to see if the people who are identified as part of the education community were more or less accurate in their estimations than the rest of the population that you sampled?
That's a good question. I have the question I wrote down for myself actually before this presentation was about direct connection to public schools. So I captured just a few more people, but that would be another one to ping. So I can follow up on that because that's an easy enough answer.
I'd be curious, of course, just as everybody here on the call knows, the commission is about to survey random sample using the Granite State poll of New Hampshire residents on a range of school funding questions. These are really attitudinal questions, not knowledge kinds of questions like you answered. So when we look at our random sample results and your sort of self-selected folks who are part of your larger circles and reaching higher, it'll be interesting to then, those results inform each other, basically.
Absolutely.
Good point. Good point. Other questions of Liz? Okay, thank you so much for your shared with us, and I'm sure we're going to revisiting that, particularly in light of Bruce's most recent comments too.
Sure thing. Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
So let's feel free to stick around. Let's move to Dr. Carey right now, who is going to the information based on the educator survey that was conducted the end of June, first part of July.
Thanks, Mel. Just going to share my screen. So New Hampshire Listens worked with the Public Engagement Work Group to develop a survey for school and district employees in July 2020. We presented working with a policy analyst at the Kearsley School, Sarah Boji, on the analysis. We presented the part one of the more closed-ended questions a few weeks ago. And so this is the findings from the open-ended responses. So of the 15 questions, this is 11 through 15. I want to remind everybody that these are qualitative responses and this is a qualitative analysis of the findings. So just an overview, as I said, in July, we released the survey for about 2 weeks. It was a 15-question survey. And we had 1,768 employees complete the survey across 137 districts, which included charter schools. This is a descriptive analysis and it illustrates patterns in respondents' opinions and perspectives to inform commission members' thinking and discussions. Based on what we've just heard from Reaching Higher and their previous work on school funding, what AIR has shared with us, and what a number of presenters have also shared with the commission over the last several months. So just to show as a reminder of who responded to this, on the majority it was classroom teachers, special educators and administrators, and then classroom and student support staff. And then, to a lesser degree, related arts office staff, guidance, career and technical educators, health services, et cetera, as you can see on this, this table. But what it does show is that there are representatives from many points in the school system at the district level, high school, middle school, elementary, and pre-K. So Sarah and I used a coding method to analyze all the open-ended responses of each question. So we started by coding the first 50 responses independently from one another. Responses could hold more than one code. So, one respondent could talk about, for instance, class size, curriculum, and also buildings or transportation. Then we compared the codes and generated a list for each question with the acknowledgement that as we read through each response that other codes may emerge. All responses were attributed an EVPP classification, which I'll explain what that is in just a minute, and analyzed using a statistical software program called Stata to create frequency counts so that we could better see the patterns of responses. Many codes overlap by question, which points to clear areas of concern among school and district employee respondents in this particular survey. So in our findings, EVPP stands for Equalized Property Valuation per Pupil. The responses were cut into low, medium, and high groups, as well as specific charter schools and then other districts we labeled a little differently. As a reminder, everyone, EVPP is a measure of wealth. We used EVPP as a measure of wealth in a community, and it was calculated by taking the total value of property in a community divided by the number of students in a district. Information on the EVPP of each school district is publicly available from the state of New Hampshire, and I can put that link into chat after I'm done talking. Since the EVPP is a dollar amount, categories were created to designate high, medium, and low EVPP or a proxy for community wealth. And this table shows those cutoffs. And this was a way to, this is one way to analyze the data. We thought it was an interesting way to look at the different themes that came across, but it's, please also let us know if there's another interest, and we'll see if we have the time to look at that. So question 11, as it appeared on the survey, was, from your perspective, what are the most important factors in providing an adequate education to students across the state of New Hampshire? We gave them some examples just to support people who have varying knowledge of school funding. And so you said you can think about factors as what students have access to in their educational experiences at school and what influences those experiences, and the outcomes of a student's education, such as how college or career ready students are when they graduate. So of the 1,768 total responses, total respondents to the survey, 1,393 respondents answered this question, and there were 23 codes that we generated. In this presentation, we focused on the top 10 codes. And so the top 10 codes, you can take a look, were a concern about teacher, staff quality, training, and sufficient staffing. What this means is, let me see, I have to look at my code book here. So what this meant was teachers and staff need to be successful and for students to be supported. So the idea of quality of the teachers in terms of their degrees, their professional development, the retention of teachers, and the training of teachers. Those were generally what people would talk about. Class size was the number of students in a room. Technology was something people talked about quite a bit in terms of access to technology across the state, one-on-one, and especially I think in terms of the pandemic. And then just a general reference to sufficient financial resources. This was responses that were just in general terms of like not having enough in their community, challenges in small towns, rural communities, noting just in general property taxes or lottery or Keno or another source of funding, and just mentioning that there isn't quite enough. And then you can see the other areas as well. So when we look at the responses by EVPP, we asked what district respondents work in and also what district respondents live in. So take a second to look at this table and see where there's kind of some alignments and some differences. But I think overall what we found is that there's similarities amongst respondents across EVPPs, or community wealth, concerns in certain areas that have to do with school funding. So the quality of teachers, technology and class size, just sufficient resources in general, curriculum, and then the salaries of teachers, and then the equity in terms of making sure that all students in the communities across New Hampshire have access to or an opportunity to an adequate education. So, and then this is a table based on where the respondents live. So not all respondents lived and worked in the same district. So out of 1,393 respondents at question 11, 358 respondents work in districts classified as having a low equalized property valuation per pupil. 709 respondents worked in a medium-sized community, and 248 respondents worked in a high wealth community. So again, but we see across each community, we see very similar topics that people are most concerned about. So the quality of staff, the training, sufficient staff, which includes support staff. Many people mentioned the need for adequate support staff for students. Technology, the number of students, curriculum. When people talked about curriculum, they talked about a number of things. They talked about updated materials, they talked about math curriculum, they talked about extracurriculars. This is a pretty big catch-all code. The types of classes that are offering, whether they can offer foreign language, enrichment, the academic rigor of those classes, and a number of other things were mentioned. So I'm not going to read all of these quotes, and feel free to close your eyes as I read one of them or a couple of them. And just to give you a sense of what people were saying in this survey. So I'll read, the most important thing is access to well-trained teachers that have access to ongoing quality professional development. In addition to class sizes that allow for students to have more access individually to the teacher and that allows the teacher more time to plan engaging lessons. Technology in these times is extremely important, and most recently we have learned more about those that have and those that have not. This is a dairy cooperative staff, which dairy is a low, was classified as a low EVPP community, and Manchester resident, which was classified as a medium EVPP community. Teacher retention. Teacher retention is an issue in our community due to Raymond's placement on the salary scale compared to surrounding communities. We often hire many young teachers and they leave after a few years. There are limited funds for intervention programs for special education students, and the caseload numbers are excessive. These seem absurd, and an additional case manager should be hired to meet the needs of the special education population. Technology is improving, but much of the budget has been dedicated to increasing numbers for the general population, not on improving technology for special education students and teachers. And this is a Raymond staff and resident. And I move on to question 11. So this is a comparison of whether respondents live and work in the same district or not. So respondents who live and work in the same district and respondents who live and work in different districts really are focused on the same areas. So just, again, the quality of teachers and staff, class size, technology, sufficient financial resources, and curriculum. And then at the bottom, you can see buildings and facilities. I do want to note, which I didn't note before, that I just have to find my note here. Some of the least mentioned in question 11 was the duration of schools, early childhood education, charter schools, and then challenges in small towns and rural communities, although there are examples of people who mentioned those areas. So question 12, as it appears in the survey, is what are the most important components of an adequate education that be considered as part of the base formula for calculating the cost of adequacy? So of the 1,768 total survey respondents, 1,211 answered this question, and we generated 19 codes or topics based on their responses. So there's similar, across the questions, the big takeaway from this is that respondents are really concerned, which is probably not too surprising considering they're educators, they work in the school system, also remembering that they are property tax, the majority were property owners and parents in the system, former and current. Again, is this focus on making sure the curriculum works for students across the state and they have access to it, teacher, staff, and quality, technology. One that came up here is student performance and outcomes. Anecdotally, when we think about this specific code, teachers were talking about, or educators were talking about students learning, supported and measurable goals and expectation, less focus on standardized testing, the movement towards competency-based education, the individual needs of students, looking at the whole child and not just a certain set of outcomes, and sufficient supports for all learners in terms of accommodations and differentiation were things that were mentioned here. Some of the least mentioned in this area, once again, were some people talked about the duration of school, challenges in small towns and rural communities, leadership, state level supports and resources, and then transportation as well. So you can see, I'm not going to speak a ton to this, but you can see that there's similar pattern to what people are most focused on in terms of school funding, in terms of inadequate education. And I will explain here, when we see that code equity, that code equity really had to do with overall adequacy of education, funding and opportunities for students, and also a focus on race and systemic prejudice and bias, and also concerns for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds as well. Just general economic disparities across communities, general comments about feeling like the current funding formula doesn't equitably address all students' needs across the state in terms of their education. And so this, again, we split it up by low, medium, and high EVPP. Similar concerns across the board. In this case, you will see there is some more in the top 10. There's building and facilities that came in that people were concerned about. This was, people worried about not being able to update their buildings and not sure how that works. Some people weren't sure how to address that in school funding. Other people had a sense of that. So quotation from this question was, the most important factors in providing an education include having a building whose structure is safe, where children have access to water bubblers that do not contain heavy metals such as lead, that have bathrooms on more than one floor of a multi-floor building, and that have straws available for students to drink their milk at breakfast and lunch. Important factors to providing an education include teaching science and social studies every day from teachers who are actually certified to teach, having appropriate special education tests for identification purposes, having appropriate Tier 3 special education programs such as LIPS and Orton Gillingham. LIPS is a program by Lindenwood Bell Learning Processes, and have special education teachers trained in these programs. Having smaller class sizes and more paraprofessionals would be nice too. And so this is a Manchester staff and Nashua resident, both under a medium EVPP. From Farmington, adequate education, which is a low EVPP, it's a resident and staff. Adequate education would be that school budget decisions would be made not on the dollar burden on a community, but on the true needs of the student population. This would include staffing that would support students' social and emotional needs, as well as resources to enrich students' experiences so they would be more equitable technologically and exposure-wise to more financially stable communities. So those are a couple examples. And then an example from a higher wealth community, Oyster River Cooperative staff, which is a medium wealth community, and then Rye resident, qualified teachers and certifications. In small schools, teachers are asked to teach more than their content area, like a math teacher teaching social studies. Under current statutes, this is legal. However, it is not doing right by our students. Technology, we need more money to provide students with access to technology. If students don't have access, we are setting them up to fail when they leave the public schools of New Hampshire. Curriculum, we need a well-funded and staffed Department of Education at the state level. With the graying of New Hampshire, we should also be thinking about how to support small schools and districts to educate their students. Do we need to rethink our SAU structure? So some of the respondents also thought about just different structures for the school districts in New Hampshire in general. They also talked about different means for funding education, and there were across the different types of districts across the state, whether it was high, medium, low, there was a concern that students have access to certain basic things in their schooling, and technology was one of those things. And I think also a access to classes. And there was concern, even though it didn't show up as a high frequency count in the codes, for small schools in particular and rural schools. So I'm going to skip over this slide for now. So question 13, as it appeared in the survey, are there barriers you can identify that inhibit an equal opportunity to an adequate education? So of the total respondents to the survey, 1,307 responded to this question, and there was 23 codes that were generated for this question. All these codes will be talked about in the report that we're writing. They'll be available in a couple weeks for further review. I'm just giving a glimpse into the different findings now, and then welcome conversation after I'm done talking about them. So in question 13, the code shifted a little bit as the question shifted a little bit. So so most people talked about equity and equitable distribution of resources. Again, insufficient financial resources. Concerns with the current school funding formula. These were comments just basic saying that it was not working. And then again, teacher quality, and then some bureaucratic barriers in leadership. In the case of this code, this was really focused on comments that were, people were talking about, you know, local budgets, tax caps, state leadership, the availability of work and economic sustainability in their community, the local voting that reduces funding for schools at times, the politics of their town, and the town voting processes that makes school funding a challenge in their communities at times. So again, what we found really interesting about this coding is that across these different economic levels of communities, the concerns are really consistently the same. So it shows that, these respondents, there's, 1,768 educators across the state of New Hampshire, we are worried about similar issues. So for instance, in this case, equity, again, people were talking about race and racism, socioeconomics, the resources, comparing communities who have more and who have less, who have concentrated needs in terms of special education, ELL, just the general disparities across districts and towns, racial disparities, the differences between rural and urban school communities, the inequities in geography, and just income differences in general. So a few examples of quotes from this question. The town-by-town funding system is the biggest barrier. It continues the cycle of poverty because poorer towns generally don't want their taxes to go up, so they don't fund their schools adequately. Richer towns have better schools. This is a John Stark regional staff with a low EVPP and Concord resident with a medium EVPP. From Contoocook, we have such a large difference between towns. It seems really unfair that the towns that have the highest population of transients, people accessing English language services, low socioeconomic status, et cetera, also often have way fewer resources. In small towns, it only takes a couple very involved students to utilize all the resources. Both those students and all the other students deserve to get exactly what they need. For example, in Henniker staff and a Hopkinton resident, yes, local control, relying on property taxes, racism, and politics can inhibit equal opportunity to an adequate education. A lack of state and federal viewpoint that all children should get the same educational opportunities, inhibiting equal access for all. And this is posted online under today's calendar, so people can read over this more thoroughly. And then there will be more in the report that's forthcoming. I'll read one more from this section that is from Berlin staff and resident. High-speed internet access, students not being given the same opportunities depending on what county they live in, money per student being different according to the county that they live in. I'll read one more, actually, I'll read one more from Molten Borough. Lack of funds for each town. Some towns are so cash strapped and or have so many students they cannot possibly afford their own schools or to send students to a nearby school. The state should provide more money to towns. I've only read a few selections from here. I tried to select quotes across communities and across low, medium, and high districts in terms of their wealth. But I do encourage everyone here listening, part of the commission, to kind of read through some of these quotes to get a sense of the different perspectives across communities in New Hampshire more thoroughly. I'm gonna skip that table for now. So question 14 was, in your opinion, what is working and what are the problems with the way we raise and distribute funds for public schools in New Hampshire? 1,220 respondents answered this question out of 1,768. We did not code this question, but I did read through all the responses and I found some themes that emerged from those responses. I'm going to read each of these themes. So the district and school employees saw problems with, and I think that these themes in question 14 really speak to the broader themes of the other questions as well. So we saw some coded counts of what people are focused on, and then these descriptive themes, I think, also bring out those responses in more of a general way. So districts and school employees saw problems with the way funds are distributed in general and wanted more equity, in some cases suggested more choices for families. So there were respondents in the survey that wanted choice in terms of charter schools or district choices for their students. Small and more rural districts accrue extra costs in a variety of ways, which can include transportation and professional development. That was a concern of people responding to this survey and in responding to question 14. The limited tax base in some communities can also limit school funding. The dependence on property taxes in poorer towns creates inequity that is noticeable among residents and school or district employees. People express that statewide resources and equitable funding need to be considered to remove crosstown disparities in both rural and urban settings. There were people in this survey that, that both advocated for state-based tax and also were against it. But there was mention of that in terms of one type of statewide resource. Local control was desirable in some ways, but people acknowledged that there were limits and positives to both when considering the needs of students and the equitable opportunities for positive outcomes. Many people noted that there is a noticeable increase in mental and behavioral challenges among children that is requiring extra staff and specialists who can provide supports, and finding qualified staff and professionals who are able to provide those supports effectively. Local knowledge, community engagement, voting, and bureaucracy, along with unfunded mandates from the legislature or the New Hampshire DOE, people felt could limit decisions and further complicate school funding. We also heard this theme in the municipal and school leader focus groups. When people talked about local knowledge and community engagement, they were really talking about how do we bring the learning and understanding about school funding into the community so more informed decisions can be made by residents. Choosing how and what to fund in communities remains challenging as more people live on fixed incomes or incomes that do not match the rising costs of living in the state. Distributions of funds in communities can be very challenging when balancing multiple community needs. People mentioned, balancing the needs of infrastructure, police, buildings, or broadband internet in some cases. There are a variety of things that people mentioned in terms of other community needs. And then so the final question in the survey was just to provide some additional comments. 708 respondents provided some additional comments or asked questions for the commission. And so I gathered a few different questions from different school districts. So for instance, in the middle here, why is apportionment for cooperative school districts allowed to be based on ADM when no other aspect of school funding or other funding is based on anything other than assessed property values? ADM apportionment is equivalent to tuition-based funding, the antithesis of true public education intended to provide maximum societal benefits without regard for one's specific usage of the service. So this is from a Hollis Brookline cooperative staff and resident, which is a medium EVPP. Why do we lock students into a school system based upon their address? Let towns set the tax rate and the state set an adequate funding amount, then let parents shop for the school. So there were people in this survey who are advocates for school choice as well. A question here, why doesn't the state provide a separate line item for textbooks and technology? How do we keep good teachers in lower income schools? Why must towns like Pittsfield suffer high taxes and not be able to provide an extracurricular like a 4-year language program? Concerns about the aging population in the state. So I'm going to stop my share, but one thing I wanted us to think about, this is really just a glimpse of the findings from this survey. Based on what we've learned so far, what we heard from Reaching Higher New Hampshire, the presenters, AIR, our other focus groups, and where we're moving forward into focus groups with youth, senior residents, taxpayer associations, and bringing back school municipal leaders, what do we want to keep in mind?
Thank you, Carrie. A lot of information here.
I know.
I can only imagine the dilemma that you and Sarah had in trying to provide some coding for the gathering, or at least the assimilation of all this data. So thanks so much. Questions that you might have of Carrie as we look at this data? Dave.
Thanks, Mel. Thanks, Carrie. That's a lot of data, and great information and great analysis on that. Thanks. Thank you for all of that hard work. Actually, I was wondering if you could pop one of the one of your slides was talking about question 14.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me when I was reading the bullets that that maybe question 14 might have provided a little bit of response resolution to the local versus state property tax question. So I saw so no, on that one, limited tax space in some communities can also limit funding for schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I saw the dependence on property tax. All right, and I guess it's the next item. And I would on that last page, the one the dependence on property taxes in poor towns creates an inequity. And I was wondering if anything in those two findings or those two themes might have some read on the question that I asked Liz earlier about the perception or any sort of perceived differences in a state property tax versus a local property tax.
I'd have to look through like the specific, like I can sort the Excel spreadsheet again and look a little more. Searching specifically for that. There are a number of references to state-based taxes, and so I can sort to see more. I can look into more of like what people are talking about in terms of that question, because I think that there's varying knowledge here that's clear. So like these themes, what I'm sharing here is an advocating for, a certain, this is kind of like how people are thinking about, school funding in a kind of an anecdotal, total way. So I can do some sorting about that. And see
Okay.
what
Okay. I definitely, hear what Liz is saying, that for a lot of people, they're, how well they understand the state versus local, property tax, and what's the distinction really there, might be difficult, but just trying to see how some of the public perception might be sort of coming through on that issue.
Well, I think I need to realize too that the respondents to this particular survey are those individuals that work within the system.
Right.
And I think that we need to recognize that there obviously is a certain knowledge base of the impact of school funding on the work that they do. So these are not unbiased, uninvolved people. These are individuals that are working daily with the issues that we're trying to deal with on the school in the commission's work. Okay. Other questions of Carrie? Jay?
So I'll throw out a couple of things and get a concern. So one is, as you're presenting, I was struck by the price of local control. We pay a price for local control.
Yeah.
I don't know that we don't recognize it so much, but 170,000 students is the size of a county in New York State. I see my point, David and Corinne. And all right, I think we do. I don't know what we do with that thought, but there was another observation that I think it's important, and I'm getting more and more sensitive about this. You're going to keep hearing it. This is probably the second or third time today. When we say adequate education, I really think it's important that we have opportunity for adequate education. It just changes what our goal is in this state, from something that's input driven to something that lifts all the tide for all boats, for all students. And so I think opportunity is really an important, that's the noun in this, not adequacy. So the third is, how do you suppose conducting these surveys, which are still reflecting on our experience as of last year, are going to differ, or it's really the other way around? How do you suppose our responses in October in public interest meetings are going to be different from all of our other experience? Like your observations about choice. Is that going to rise to number one because of where people are at in October? It just caused me that there's so much about where we are at a particular point in time. And I don't know if where we are in October is really predictive of where we're going to be in 2 years. But where we were last March, or our reflections on where we were, aren't going to be where we're going to be trying to skate to. Anyway, Carrie, you're our survey maven for this project, and I wonder what kind of apprehensions you and Mel have for trying to gauge where people are at because of a particular circumstance in October. All right, enough of that. And maybe David and Corinne have observations about how we're stuck in this transformative period without really knowing, are we swimming back to shore or off to another island?
It seems to me that with this pandemic and where we are, my sense is that as we come out of this thing, how we have viewed education is in fact going to change. I mean, we have been able to engage students in different kinds of ways than we've ever engaged before. And some school districts adapted quickly. Concord is an example. I mean, they had been doing a lot of remote learning with kids who couldn't come to school, either they were ill or whatever, and their adaptation was fairly seamless. Other school districts did not happen that way. I think we've also found out that what this survey talked about from the standpoint of inequities, the pandemic has also demonstrated inequities, particularly around access to the internet, access to technology. So my sense is, Jay, is that a year from now, hopefully we're on this thing, I think it is going to be different. I mean, I'm looking at really David and Corinne, who've been out there most recently dealing with schools, etc. I don't know. That's just my sense. You guys have been in those and had to make those management decisions that are going to impact kids. So you're the ones who really ought to respond to this thing.
Want to go first?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Corinne. Go ahead. Then David.
yeah, what comes to mind to me is now that, we're starting to set precedent on variety of learning platforms with on-site, with remote, or a hybrid. And how would funding look for those three kinds of programs? And I think we have to be ready to be able to consider, the funding sources for that. I think it changes the game because not everybody's going to want to come back in a traditional school setting now that they've had the opportunity or experience in a different medium. But if they're enrolled in our public schools, we are responsible for them. So that does raise a question as to, well, how is that going to look? And what does that cost? And I'm wondering if there's a way to cost out any difference between remote learning and on-site full-time, if there is a difference. I don't know. We still need teachers, but are there any expenses in that, is it the MS, the DOE 25 that we have to report that does not exist when you're doing remote learning? So I don't know, David might be more fresh in that than I am.
I wish I wasn't, Corinne. I think about this from a political frame too. If we all put our Bowman and Deal hats on for a second, look at what the impact is, the ripple effect to how parents are approaching what we're in right now and what we're able to provide for education. Are they feeling as though they're getting value for the dollars that are spent? And if we can't ever get people past this notion that learning only happens inside of four walls, and what we've really done is we've proven that school as we know it is more about, at least from what I'm seeing and feeling, childcare.
Right.
About a supervised 7.5-hour experience for people's children that we also facilitate learning during that time, because what else are we going to do? What I'm seeing is people at home, students at home, whether they're 7-year-olds or 17-year-olds, still exploring and, essentially learning, even though they're in their own bedroom or they're in their kitchen or they're in their living room. And in a lot of cases, at a much higher level than some of the experiences we've seen in physical school prior to March. That could be dependent upon the student, that could be dependent upon the environment, because that becomes a question too, right, Corinne? I mean, we know
Right.
that,
I mean, the environment is key.
yeah,
I
kids
mean,
who come
you're
to
going
us
to lose a lot of kids.
unprepared
Yeah.
are already behind the 8 ball, and they're coming from homes where they're not able to be prepared, as well as other kids who are born on third base and tell everyone they hit a triple.
Yep.
So it really is, I think, bigger than just the money aspect. The question that's being posed is, what is the future of education?
Right.
That to me seems to be the essential question, because costing it is something we're able to ultimately do, but if we don't know what it is and we can't get past a brick and mortar approach, I don't know if much will change. I mean, for the last 100 years, it hasn't.
Well, the dilemma I think that we have too is that I think kids today have much higher level of the gaining of information than ever before. So to come to school just to merely get information, they don't they were learning how to do that over the years. The question is what do you do with the information that you gather? And I'll never forget. I was in this would have been 7 years ago. I was in Ohio, and a young man, we were having a panel of high school kids there, and at lunch, I was having lunch with him. He says, Mr. Miley, he says, I don't really need to go to school to get information now. He says, I can use this. Now this was times ago, and I said, what do you mean? He says, well, ask me a question. I asked him a question, and he plugged it into his phone. He says, is this the answer? See, I can get the information. What I don't know how to do is what to do with that information.
Right.
That's what I need schools. That's what I need schools for. But the kids come to school with a much higher level of their own way of gathering information, gathering intelligence. And so, I mean, the idea of the sage on the stage is gone. And so it's how we begin to do it. I also was thinking about homeschoolers. I'm saying, well, no, they're saying, we've been doing this for a long time. But if you're now providing this information from schools on a remote basis, why can't I gather that calculus class from school to home? And how that's all going to fit into it. So I do think that there's going to have to be some kind of a coming together here on exactly what have we learned throughout this whole thing, and that it's more of an esoteric conversation right now, but it does relate to where the money flows to help kids learn. Carrie?
I did want to share some codes that didn't come up in those initial tables that they'll be in the appendix of the report, is kind of what David was just referring to in schools, is this idea of community engagement and communication, and also family and support in the home environment. Those were codes that we tracked, and there were some substantial quotes about that, especially in terms of families' needs, like families' basic needs. And I did wonder, and of course, this is qualitative findings, so there's, we're looking at people's perspectives in general. But this survey was distributed in July 2020, which was just after the first year of the pandemic, as we're going through this first school year, first half of a year. And so the frequency of the code technology was clear. So that was clear. Access to technology, especially in rural and poorer districts, was a major concern. But another concern that came out that didn't necessarily, make the top 10, but was kind of filtered through all the different comments, is kind of that idea of the whole student and the family and the community. And so like students' mental health, their behavioral health, their basic needs, food. We know so many schools during the pandemic delivered food, where food was delivered by school buses because children were being transported. And so just this concern about meeting students' basic needs, mentions of food, we kind of coded those under buildings and facilities sometimes just to kind of narrow things down. And just like you're saying, like parents' ability to engage with their children at home, it varies, especially in terms of what parents' work schedules are. So that point of like moving in the future, if these different models exist, how much more is parent education, parent involvement, and community involvement, wrapping around the student going to matter? Not that it shouldn't have always mattered, but maybe like that's a kind of a raised up a conversation in some ways. So I did want to mention that is something that came out as a theme in this as well.
Bruce.
Yeah, Mel, let me try a little bit of respond to the past few comments about what we're learning in the pandemic about schooling. I start with the notion that we don't know yet what we're learning. We're going to be 2 to 3 years from now before we really know what it is we're learning right now. So we need to be a little careful about drawing any conclusions about how this is changing, how all this is changing the way we do public schools. That's one observation. The second is the surveys, both Reaching Higher and our educator survey, focused on inputs. What do you think are the key components to an opportunity for an adequate education or an adequate education? And so we hear about teacher qualifications, we hear about curriculum, we hear about building and facilities. So not all, but a lot of the most frequently commented responses there were about inputs. And the commission, of course, is shifting towards a focus on how to understand what it costs to create the opportunity for a comparable education for all students, which is an outcome focus. I expect that in our report, in the end, transportation is going to be, that continues to be a question for us. Do we treat it as a categorical program or somehow fold the costs into the base adequacy formula? We haven't decided yet on that. But transportation is a variable that clearly can be affected by the amount of remote learning versus hybrid learning versus in-person learning. And so that argues probably to put transportation as it has been in the categorical bucket typically. So school districts are funded for transportation based on their need in that community or how they're delivering education, not based on some average overall cost. Building and facilities, I think, that's going to be a challenge in terms of the pandemic here, because maybe we don't need as many spaces for kids in schools if we're going to do more remote learning. On the other hand, the facilities themselves, the HVAC systems, the sanitation processes, all are going to cost more, even if we have one child in that building or one staff member in that building at any given time. Teacher qualifications is probably really significant here. And that came to the top across all of those different samples. And in the end, the way we're doing teaching now and in the future will depend on our teachers and their ability to manage this really complex process. So on the other side of this coin, the last thing I want to say about, in terms of providing sort of an overall understanding of the input so far from our surveys is, and taking into account the data we're learning nationally and in New Hampshire about the impacts of COVID-19, our 3 areas of differentiated aid, poverty, special education, and ELL, those are the populations most disparately impacted, to use that term, by COVID, by the pandemic. Poor kids are less likely to be connected, less likely to have access to internet, less likely to have devices, less likely to have the kind of family support they need to survive at home remote learning. special education kids are really vulnerable if they can't go to school and be in a therapeutic setting or in a group setting or with their therapists and specialists. And ELL, while I think there's a little bit less data yet, if part of English language learning, we'll hear about this in an hour or two, is being immersed in an English speaking environment like a public school, then what happens to ELL kids if they're learning remotely at home? They may learn the technical aspects of speaking English quite effectively, but the social communication pieces, of course, are going to be a real challenge if they're staying in their homes and in their neighborhoods where they're only hearing a limited number, not so much English, but other language as well. Those last things, poverty, special education, ELL, of course, are the equity sort of factors in all of this. We did hear a lot of the educators say that equity was one of the top 10 components, if you will, of what goes into their definition of an adequate education. So I think it's possible, even within the time of COVID, to parse out some factors that we don't know enough yet about to say anything about long-term impact. Some that we can begin to say, that this might argue that we keep, for example, transportation in a separate bucket, given how directly impacted it is by the location of where kids are learning. And those other factors, what we're now calling our differentiated aid weightings, I think this argues for being sure that those weights are significant enough to, I'll use the term, protect the educational experience of those kids in order to give them an opportunity for comparable education to their peers. So I think there's a way to thread this needle in this kind of historical moment that still allows us as a commission to both respond to contemporary conditions, but also anticipate what things might look like in the future. I'll stop there. Sorry for the long speech.
Thanks, Bruce. Other questions or comments regarding Carrie's report? A lot of data there. And thanks, Sarah, for helping out to conduct the report here, Carrie.
She keeps
Any
me
other questions?
No, I appreciate.
All right.
Mel, I just appreciate the discussion because while I was studying what Carrie presented, I was also thinking about your next challenges of trying to interact with groups, and I appreciate the inputs that folks just offered to try to. We're going to need to sort through those comments in categorical ways. I had a parent at home. Yeah. I'm a parent with a kid at home, or I'm a parent who works and can't be at home, and they're new sorts that we need to try to tease out I'm going to sign off, but I was reminded of our earlier conversation, Mel, and folks. How often do committees need to meet? And I know I'm going to ask that at 3:00, but this is getting to be that sensitive period of time where we've got to turn things around quick. Right.
Thanks, Jay. And that's a nice segue. Carrie, you want to report on the next phase of engagements that you're working on as far as the groups that we're going to be dealing with in the next 6 weeks?
Yep. I'm going to pull up. Let me just find it on my desktop. I thought I had it up, but I don't. So I can say that we do have a series of engagement activities that are coming up fairly soon. I have been working with the communications person at the Carsey School, and we're sending out invites to the different focus groups this week. So we have Youth Voice. So that's a focus on high school age students and people who are 1 or 2 years out of high school. you all will be receiving those invites to pass along for the specific groups. We're going to be gauging in taxpayer associations. I made a list, but also a woman called me this weekend. I haven't heard back from her, and she has some suggestions about who can be involved in that focus group. We're going to be talking to residents who are 65 plus. And then we're also going to be gathering once again the municipal and school leaders that we talked to in June. And so those are the engagement activities that are coming up, as well as promoting the public commenting sessions and the youth voice sessions. I've been working with colleagues in New Hampshire Listens to help guide that process, as well as reaching Higher New Hampshire in terms of designing a guide and using some of their accessible materials that they generate about school funding to help frame the conversation for students. Yeah. And so that is where we're heading. And I wanted to build on Bruce's comment, because I have been thinking about this as well. That the survey findings and the questions we asked at the June stakeholder or the municipal and school area focus groups were really based on inputs, components, factors. And so framing these focus groups that are coming up, I want to be able to provide information for people. Mel, you can talk a little more about your thinking, but making sure we have some framing. And that was one of the tasks of this group to think about, and the questions that help people hold a conversation that informs this group moving forward. So I just wanted to put that out there, and then I'm going to share my screen with the activities.
Well, one of the things that is being developed is a video for students and those who've just graduated, to try to provide a characterization of the issues around school funding. And Carrie and I were talking earlier today that is a fairly basic, going to be a fairly basic video that basically talks about a student who was in an affluent town and then moves to a less affluent town, and talks about, why don't we have this? Why don't we have, I've got that in my other district, I don't have it here. And depending upon how that looks, I was suggesting that might be a video that was not only directed at students, but people who just aren't that informed around school funding anyway, that might provide at least a kind of a common basis to initiate a conversation. So that's one thing that we're kind of looking for too. So we'll get, and once that video is done, we'll share that with the work group here to get your input on that too. And along is a guide for a conversation guide, and Carrie's in the process of developing several guides. There'll be similar issues in there as we begin to have these conversations with these various interest groups. So,
Mel, that video may be useful for the legislative briefing that we are hoping.
Absolutely, yeah. My sense is that as I looked at the original script for it, I was saying, geez, I mean, this is just pretty basic stuff. And I think it might be a guide. So, Carrie, one of the questions I had too, when does the, go ahead.
I wanted, sorry to interrupt, Mel.
Yeah.
I wanted to emphasize that is the work of Reaching Higher New Hampshire, and they're being very thoughtful in their partnership in offering this accessible piece of information for the community. So I wanted to emphasize that their work and the partnership there.
When actually, in September, does the survey actually be conducted from UNH, the UNH survey?
That's on my list of tasks to follow up on, and I hope that Bruce, do you have a sense of that, or I see you?
sometimes when I hit my space bar to mute, it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's totally mysterious to me. I thought that Granite State poll was scheduled for third week of September, but that's.
Third week, okay.
So we can confirm that. It's coming right up.
Also, I would add, and Mary Heath just put in the chat room, is a briefing of the Finance Committee. And I would put that in the, when it says legislative learning exchange, I would add that too, because I think that's an important point too.
Okay. See you guys.
Okay. All right. So are there, we're kind of bumping up against the next Zoom call. Anything else for Carrie or on this particular topic?
So just for a second, Mel.
Sure, sure, Jay.
So Wednesday we've got a house session day starting 10 o'clock at the Whittemore Center. I don't think that's going to go all day. This is a veto day, so the legislature has to take up vetoed bills. And but we also have scheduled, I think, a public comment, extended public comment for 4 o'clock.
Yeah. Yes.
So yeah. So I think we'll be back in time for that. But I just want to make sure we have a backup. I don't know if Carrie can be back up on that. If to just open the meeting and and bring people through it in case Mel and I are not back.
Yeah. I will not be involved because I'll be in Dana-Farber during that.
Right.
Day, so.
Right.
And that's a student voice focused session. So I'm more than happy. It's on my calendar. I can open that up and.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we've got backup in place for that. The other thing is, Mel, you and Bruce and Jay and I got an email. School Funding Fairness Project would like to present their petition along with signatures. Is that a good day to do that, or should how do? And I know Jeff's online. Jeff's attending right now, watching this, but
why wouldn't they do that for the whole commission?
well, this is the extended. Is this a special extended comment? So this isn't the regular extended public comment period.
This is one of two student focused. So for young voices, and we'll see how many people come out, but I hope that there will be some youth that come and speak about school funding.
Okay. Then I'll figure out from when the next extended public comment period is, or potentially next Monday during public comment at the commission, at the full commission meeting.
David, I think that's a more appropriate time to have them do that.
At the full commission?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. I'll convey that then. All right.
All right. Okay, guys, we're all set.
See you in 10 minutes.
All right, thanks.
All right.
Take care, guys. Good luck, guys. Okay, take care. Thanks, Dave. Thanks.